From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Come January, the U.S. Senate could be an inhospitable place for Rhode Island's two Democratic senators, with the GOP taking control of that chamber for the first time since 2006. That's new territory for U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And there are big things to tackle in the coming months, including another government funding debate, tax reform, and controversial changes to immigration rules. Our guest this week on Newsmakers, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. Good morning, everyone. And Senator, welcome back to the program. It's really good to have you.
Good to be with you, Tim. Ted.
Good to see you. So as I said there, come January, you will be part of the minority party in the U.S. Senate, a first for you this week.
New experience.
Yes. So let's talk about that new experience. Incoming Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell called the November elections, quote, butt-kicking. Were the midterms a referendum of President Obama and the Democratic Party?
I think they were. All of the candidates in the Senate who lost have said, I could not get over the anti-Obama sentiment. So I think there was very strong anti-Obama sentiment. What's interesting is that there's subsequent polling that asks Americans, are you happy that the Republicans control Congress? And 50% say no, and 40-some percent say yes. So on the one hand, it was a referendum, I think, on the president. It was not, it does not appear, a referendum on Republicans in Congress, at least not a very positive one.
What do you make of that sentiment towards the president?
I think that he has got some work to do to try to rebuild his credibility with a lot of American voters. And I think he has to be a lot more vigorous at pushing back at some of the stuff that people have been led to believe about him and about the work that he's done. I think there's a almost cartoon quality to a lot of the stuff that has been pushed out into the public.
So you don't think it's him as a president? You think it's misinformation? It's I think
bad
PR?
A president is responsible for his own PR, no doubt about it. And he's responsible for his relationships. And I think both could use improvement.
Okay. There's been a lot of talk that the president's personality hinders him in Washington. Some people push back and say, nope, it's just partisanship at the end of the day. What do you think as someone on the ground there? Has President Obama done enough to build relationships both across the aisle and with his fellow Democrats?
I think he could do a lot more. He could certainly do a lot more. You're not going to change the world just through relationships, but in clinch after clinch, a relationship can make the difference between finding the way and not finding the way. And it can take some of the venom out of the personal exchanges. So I think that everybody pretty much concedes that they could do a much better job of that.
One person whose analysis of the election made headlines was your colleague Chuck Schumer of New York. He said recently, quote, that in 2009, Democrats blew the opportunity the American people gave them. We took their mandate and put all of our focus on the wrong problem, health care reform. Do you agree with Senator Schumer?
Not exactly. I think we had to do something about health care. The system was completely unjust and, as a cost matter, out of control. So I think we had to take that on. And I'm glad that we did. And I think that the law has turned out pretty well for most families when you actually look at the results of it. There's a campaign to have Obamacare as a concept look terrible, but once you drill through that to protecting against pre-existing conditions, keeping kids on parents' policies after college, those sorts of things, people love that stuff. So I think we did a pretty good job with that. Could have done more, probably should have done more, but maybe we did all we could with the votes we had. What I think Chuck was getting at was that we had not pushed hard enough on getting the underlying economic problem solved. The stimulus, I think, was way too small, and it cut out entire areas like rebuilding schools when we have schools all over Rhode Island and all over the country that could use a lot of repair and rebuilding. And I think we've not done the job that we should have on infrastructure. Now, it's been tough because the Republicans have made it their purpose to try to create dysfunction and to try to create distress about Washington. And so they have not been good partners. And
but the stimulus, that goes all the way back to when you had 60 votes up through that first year.
Yeah, but we still needed to get a few Republicans for that. We still had to get, I think we had Olympia Snow,
Susan Collins,
and Susan Collins, and
maybe Specter.
Arlen Specter, exactly. Thank you. So, and they were the ones who said, you know, we got to draw some lines here, and so schools are out, and here's the limit, and so forth. I think what we've seen since then is that in the countries where they went the way the Republicans wanted us to go, which is cut your way out of the catastrophe, it hasn't gotten better. In some cases, it's gotten worse. GDP has fallen, whereas we've seen, you know, month after month after month after month of job growth and a steady, if not vigorous, recovery. So our strategy seems to have worked better, and probably would have worked better still if it had not been handicapped by the Republican desire to cut our way out of it.
I can see Ted and I pivoting back to this conversation later, but I want to get to something that's in the headlines a lot lately. Tensions are, I guess you could say, high between police and the minority communities, with both Ferguson and New York City spilling over to protests. All right, you've worked closely with law enforcement as a U.S. attorney and a Rhode Island attorney general. Sort of a simple question here. Do you think officers should wear body cameras?
I don't know. I know that the cameras that have been attached to police vehicles have often proven very helpful in dealing with situations and proving what did or did not happen. Whether a body cam works is something that I don't have the technical expertise. It's certainly something that is worth trying, so we learn more about it and taking it to a larger scale so we see how that works. But I don't know. I think that the issue is really going to be to try to figure out how you get the law enforcement community and the minority community listening to each other better, rather than just having cameras on people.
All right, is there then to that the more fundamental problem, if you think there is one, do you think there's any role Congress can play here, or is it mainly a state and local issue?
I think it's largely a state and local issue. I think it's important for Congress and for the president to pay attention to it. The people who are out protesting feel extremely hurt and wounded and overlooked. And so to show that we are listening, to have the president bring people into the White House and show that he is listening, I think is an important part of the healing and the reconciliation. So I think that that has been important. But, you know, when we had our tragedy here with Cornell Young,
yes.
That created very much of the situation that we've seen recently in Ferguson and in New York. And I think it was a terrific learning experience. If you look at what the Providence police became after that, and you look at how almost uniquely they beautifully handled the Occupy protests here in Providence, how well they've started working with the community, with the street workers program, with local churches and local ethnic organizations, Southeast Asian groups, so forth. They learned a powerful lesson, and they've gotten, I think, much, much better at it. So I think in some ways we actually provide a model in Rhode Island for how you can make these improvements, and I think Chief Clements and the people at the Providence Police Department are a very good example of that.
Switching topics, President Obama's executive order on immigration, a lot of talk about that, the way he's regularized, perhaps the word would be folks who are here without documents. Do you support that executive order?
Yeah, I do. I think that, I really wish that the House had been willing to take up an immigration bill. We sent them a Senate bill that was bipartisan. I was in the Judiciary Committee. We worked on it for weeks. We had hundreds of amendments. I think there were probably only a handful of amendments that were resolved on a party line basis. I mean, it was real old-fashioned legislating. We came to a good bill. It passed the Senate with a strong bipartisan vote, and they wouldn't even take it up. So the reason we did all that work is because we have a broken immigration system. You can't pretend that's not the case. And the president waited 500 days, more than 500 days. That's a long wait to give them a chance to act. When it finally became apparent that they weren't going to do anything, I think he had to do what he had to do. And he didn't do our whole bill. He went to the Department of Justice and to the Department of Homeland Security and said, okay, get your lawyers together, find out what is within my executive power to do, and that's not constitutionally in question, and let's do that.
But I'm
and
sure
that's
I'm
what
not
he's done.
the only one who remembers Democrats complaining a lot about President Bush's use of executive power, the way his lawyers said he could use his executive authority. I mean, is it hypocritical now for Democrats, because you agree with the underlying policy, to support a president being very aggressive in his use of his powers?
I don't think so. The critiques that I remember of President Bush was not just the use of executive power, but the misuse of executive power. For instance, telling people that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and therefore we needed to go in and start that war, or failing to properly investigate what rules were required about torturing people, and having these bogus Department of Justice opinions that subsequently had to be withdrawn because they were so poorly done. And it was that kind of almost cheating on the facts and on the rules that was my main objection. The president has gone right out there in plain view and said, here's what I'm going to do, here's the legal support for it, here's the need for it, and it's pretty sensible stuff. It's expanding the dreamers, the young kids who've come in so that they can be older, and it's saying we're not going to break up families if the kid is a proper American citizen, unless there's some pretty strong reason for doing it, like violence, and we're going to improve border security on the most secure border we've ever had. So you'll notice that the Republicans are not criticizing the result. They're criticizing the process and the use of power. I think they're just mistaken about that.
Yeah, but it sounds, for a lot of people, they're going to hear you say that and go, well, Senator Whitehouse is fine to usurp the legislative process when he agrees with the policy.
The legislature that is complaining about this act has it within its power to stop it tomorrow. All they have to do is take up a bill. You can't be Speaker Boehner and refuse to do your work for more than a year, refuse to take up a bill at all, and then complain when the president acts within his executive authority. You may not like it, but you can cure it tomorrow by passing a bill, but he doesn't want to bring it up because he doesn't want to unleash his extremists and get people looking at what that far fringe of the Republican Party looks like.
So can we expect you to stay quiet if a Republican, Marco Rubio, or someone else is president in 2017 and makes very aggressive use of their executive powers?
Well, I can complain about the result, and I can complain about the motivation. I think that's all fair, but I think that as long as they are within what the lawyers say is their executive authority, it wouldn't be right to say that it's unconstitutional.
Have you spoken to Governor-elect Gina Raimondo, and have you given her any advice?
I have spoken to her. I'm excited about her candidacy. I think it's going to be exciting for Rhode Island to see a chief executive who is very smart, very determined, very hardworking, and wants to get a lot of stuff done. The last one that we had who I think filled that category was Governor Sondland.
Who, of course, you worked
who
for.
I worked for, so
what
I have this
lessons do you take
terrific
from
sense
that?
of remembrance of that. The top lesson that I take from that is that all this talk about how the legislature is so powerful in Rhode Island and the governor really can't get anything done never crossed Bruce Sondland's mind. And it frankly didn't cross the staff's mind. If you've got a governor who's motivated, who's willing to engage, who's willing to use the different levers of power and budget and bully pulpit that the governor has, you can get an immense amount done. And you can run circles around the General Assembly. And so
Not that you're advising her to run circles around your fellow Democrats.
No, but I think it's important that we set the bar high. And I think Rhode Island has kind of lost its vision of what a really powerful and effective governor can look like. And I'm hoping that Gina brings that back and resets the bar to the level that Governor Sondland set it at.
Okay, we're going to take a break on the program. We still have a lot to talk about on the table. Our guest this week is U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right is WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. Our guest this week is U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator, this month you proposed legislation that would tax carbon emissions, $42 a ton. A couple of things on this topic. First, I'm wondering if this hike in the tax on carbon emissions isn't just going to get passed along to electric ratepayers.
Some of it likely would, which is why it's so important that the bill returns every single dollar that's raised in revenue back to Americans. And I have left how you do it a little bit open because I'm hoping at some point to entice a Republican co-sponsor. But in the meantime, I've made a suggestion to demonstrate at least what the possibilities are. And you could lower the corporate tax rate from 35 to 30%, which would benefit, for instance, CVS here in Rhode Island and all of its customers and employees. You could give a $500 rebate to every American taxpayer against their payroll tax, which helps offset those costs. For seniors, you could do another $500 added Social Security payment, and you can add hundreds of dollars per family to the earned income tax credit for the lowest income folks. That takes virtually all of the money and puts it back. There's a little wobble about the details until we get the actual hard pricing, but the concept I'm very determined to stick to, and that is that this is not a way to raise revenues for bigger government or more regulation or any of that.
It sounds like you're trying to woo Republicans with your bill by saying that. You're leaving that part open.
Absolutely. Arthur Laffer, who was Ronald Reagan's economist, has come out in favor of a carbon tax. George Shultz and Hank Paulson, two Republican secretaries of the Treasury, have come out in favor of a carbon fee. We had a witness from the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the hard right-wing shops in Washington, in front of me in the Environment Public Works Committee the other day, and I got him to admit that greenhouse gases are a real problem, and a carbon fee is a way we should look at solving them. So we're getting closer to a place where Republicans and Democrats can come together and solve what is a very real problem for Rhode Island, for our fishermen, for our coastal homeowners, for the folks who have factories near rivers. It's a big problem for Rhode Island.
I'm curious, in your press release, you didn't call it a tax, you called it a fee. I mean, isn't it
because
a tax?
I want to emphasize, I think when people hear the word tax, they think, tax is how you raise money to fund the operations of government. And I want to be clear from the very get-go, right down to the nomenclature I use, that this is designed to be what the economists call revenue neutral, to have 100% of the money go back through lower taxes to Americans, and predominantly to working Americans.
Yeah, but again, if it's passed along to ratepayers, I mean, call it a fee, call it a tax, the American public could be spending more to however you want to spend it or hope to spend it.
Hence the $500 check to offset that.
But your bill does not specifically lay that out. You're leaving that open-ended.
I'm leaving that open. That's an
happens.
example. But what's clear is I want to send all the money back. And I've offered that as an example to hope that I can attract Republican support. Because this is an idea that Republicans agree with when they're not stuck in Congress with the polluters' money threatening them.
You have fought hard against the Keystone Pipeline, but it nearly passed, and now there's going to be more support for it in the incoming Congress. I mean, is that fight lost? Is it almost certainly going to pass next year?
It's almost certainly going to pass Congress next year. I doubt the Keystone supporters have the votes to override a presidential veto.
Do you think he'll veto
So
it?
it comes down, he would not say so firmly, but all of the signals from the White House were yes, 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 yes. Now, we've had signals yes, 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 and in the last minute it disappears before, so I'd give it a 90+% chance right now based on what they've been saying.
And you're already strategizing as a minority member, which Tim mentioned at the top of the show. You told Politico recently, quote, "We will have more tools in the minority than we had in the majority," talking about you and your allies, Sherrod Brown, Elizabeth Warren, folks like that. What did you mean by that, though, in terms of having more tools? You'd think the majority would have more tools.
Interestingly, it's almost the other way around. Two things have changed. Let me put it in two categories. One is, solid bipartisan legislation where we have bipartisan work going on. And I've got bills with Republicans on cybersecurity, on sentencing reform, on corrections, on addiction and recovery, and a whole bunch of different areas. Because the Republican minority has been so god-awful about jamming up the Senate, they won't even let bipartisan bills pass. When they have the majority, they are determined to look like they can govern. And I think that's going to take the brakes off a lot of bipartisan legislation that is ready to go. So that puts us in a good position with that type of legislation. Then I've got other bills that they don't like so much, like opening up and shedding some light into the dark money that's flooding our political campaigns, or the carbon fee. These are issues, along with others. Infrastructure is a big one, where there's enormous public support. Enormous public support. So if we can put 15 or 20 people on the Senate floor pushing and pushing and pushing, nudging and shoving for better infrastructure, for some response to climate change, for making sure that billionaires aren't paying lower tax rates than brick masons, we couldn't put pressure on them before because they were in the minority. All they had to do was not show up. Now they have both responsibility and we have the freedom to move in smaller groups than an entire majority. So in a funny way, this could be a more productive Senate than we have had so far. And in an ironic way, it's going to be because the Republicans no longer have themselves in the minority to deal with.
But of course, the perception would be, well, the Republicans took over and more got done, right?
You know, sometimes life isn't fair, but I'd rather be getting stuff done.
Glass is half full.
It's less important to point the blame.
Won't that drive progressive advocates, activists crazy, though? That shouldn't you guys be doing exactly what Mitch McConnell did successfully now to get the majority back?
I don't think so. I don't think so. The Republican strategy to basically degrade and create dysfunction in the Senate is kind of consistent with their message that government doesn't work and you should all just not pay attention and let us, shrink it. I think that in the minority, we should not be trying to create inaction. We should be trying to create action. And we have big issues where the public is so with us, particularly in a presidential year, that it's going to be really hard for the Republicans to responsibly take no action on school tuition and the cost of college loans. Really? You want to run the Senate and the House of Representatives for 2 full years and do nothing on that? Do you want to own that going into 2016? That's the kind of pressure and nudging that you can bring to bear, and you don't have to wait for the least enthusiastic member of your caucus to be with you to move when you're in the minority.
I brought this up in the open, so I want to raise it now. Congress has to again pass a bill to fund the government soon, next week.
Yep.
I think, right? Okay.
Yep.
Is it possible we could see another government shutdown?
Faintly possible, because there remain a sort of fringe group of folks, Ted Cruz and Michelle Bachmann, who want that to happen. But the Republican Party has worked very hard in this election to beat down Tea Party opposition. They have strengthened their base. They've gone to their funders and said, you can't be doing this extremist stuff any longer. You've got to let us govern. And they have to prove that they can govern, having been just very destructive in the minority. So for a whole bunch of reasons, the last thing that they want is to have their opening introduction as the new majority to be a government shutdown. And Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn and Lamar Alexander and a lot of the John Thune, a lot of the big leaders on their side are as determined as they could possibly be to make sure that does not happen.
MIT healthcare expert Jonathan Gruber angered a lot of people recently when his comments surfaced that the healthcare law had been crafted so that, quote, stupid voters wouldn't understand what was going on. You've cited Gruber in the past. Did you talk to him and work with him when the law was being drafted?
No, I used his, he had a good quote at some point, and I forget what it was. I know what it was. On the question, I'm a big believer in delivery system reform. Getting healthcare out there, higher quality equals cheaper. It's an interesting fact about healthcare. And Gruber, I think, made a statement back in the day that said everything you could possibly put in that bill on delivery system reform was in there. And that's what I've used. I didn't talk to him substantively about the bill, and I think his comment is ridiculous. I was on the HELP committee that drafted the bill. We had a public, you couldn't have been more public. We met in the Kennedy caucus room. We met for weeks and weeks and weeks. We handled hundreds of amendments. The whole thing was done in the bright light of day with the TV cameras on us. And the idea that there was some, sort of sneak trick that got flung by people is just totally inconsistent with my experience of being there in the room when it happened.
We have about a minute left. Were you approached to be the U.S. Attorney General?
The press got onto that so fast.
Darn press.
And
we shot it down at PRI.
I instantly got out there and said, I'm not interested.
I know you're not interested. My
so
question is,
there was no formal approach. The only approach was regarding the Supreme Court that Senator Biden mentioned, and I want to represent Rhode Island. I don't want to do anything else, and I'm very proud that Jack Reed has made the same decision with respect to Secretary of Defense. He'd be superb, but he is so committed to Rhode Island.
Very briefly, will Hillary Clinton run for president, do you think?
I am confident of it.
Really? Have she told you?
Nope, I'm just confident from looking at her behavior and from looking at the lack of alternatives. You know, she's kind of taken the oxygen out of the room, and I will support her. I've always supported her, and I'll support her now.
10 seconds. Yes or no, is it true the Senate does a bipartisan Secret Santa?
Al Franken, of all people, started a bipartisan Secret Santa.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Love to hear more about that.
Next time.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.